Welcome to Beyond Barriers, part of the Reclaiming Narrative podcast series, where we engage with individuals and leaders who are shaping the future of inclusion. I'm your host, Juliana Ameh, and today we have an incredible, inspiring guest whose story highlights resilience, self-discovery, and a deep commitment to advocating for neurodivergent individuals. Our guest today is Dan Wilkins, who was diagnosed with autism. Dan's journey is remarkable not only because he's navigated life without a diagnosis for over 4 decades, but also because he has spent more than 20 years supporting neurodivergent individuals as both a learning disability nurse and a social worker. Dan has held leadership roles throughout his career and has been head of service in a local authority. He's deeply passionate about raising the profile of neurodiversity and ensuring that being neurodivergent is never a barrier to career progression. Dan, welcome to Beyond Barriers. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you. So Dan, I would love to begin by taking our listeners back to the start. You were diagnosed with autism just last year at the age of 42. What was that moment like for you?
It was a really kind of interesting moment because, to say, I was only diagnosed last May, so less than a year ago at the time of this recording, and I'd self-diagnosed years before, probably decades before, if I'm being honest. But to have that kind of confirmation was really interesting. It was a strange process to go through, and the whole assessment was very strange. But to have that I don't know, have it confirmed was really interesting. And to be honest with you, the last 10, nearly 11 months now, I've been on a bit of a journey with it. It's been, I know, like, it feels like the 7 stages of grief with it, really. At times it's been very up and down, and now I'm very much in the acceptance stage and have, kind of decided to embrace it. But as you said, over 4 decades, which sounds like a very long time, it's to have that confirmation at 42. You do reflect on the fact that, or I did reflect on the fact that I'd had my entire life being undiagnosed, and kind of you kind of think about, it makes you think about key bits in your life where you can see that being autistic kind of had an impact on it. So it's been interesting, really.
I wonder, did it shift the way you viewed your past experiences as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think certainly, when I look back to, when I look back to like at school and stuff like that, and kind of how I got through it, and kind of the masking I was doing back then that I wasn't conscious of. I mean, when I went to school, it was like in the 80s and 90s, neurodivergence wasn't really understood, not in the way we know about it now. And there was a very kind of old-fashioned view at the time of what autism was, do you know what I mean? So even if there had been a suspicion that I was autistic in the 90s, it's very unlikely I would have got diagnosed. I mean, I know there's still that diagnosis bias, isn't there, from the way that autism is diagnosed. So so it's biased towards, ironic, seeing as I'm a white male, that there is that bias towards it. But back then, it just wasn't understood, in the way we know it now. So I do think back to reception and primary school and secondary school, and then throughout my 20s and 30s, it's definitely shaped it. I guess one of the questions that I've asked myself and other people have asked is, would it have made a difference if I'd been diagnosed back then? Now, my autistic brain doesn't cope with that, because it's like, but I wasn't. So it's almost wasted energy, right? Because you can't kind of predict something that didn't happen. So does that make any sense? So it's kind of, I struggle with that, because I don't know if it made a difference or not, because that wasn't what happened for me. I got diagnosed at 42. What it will do, and has done, is make a difference for me going forward. And that's how I've tried to take that diagnosis, really. Just to develop that understanding of myself, develop that understanding more broadly of kind of neurodivergence.
Absolutely. I think you touched on sort of your primary school experiences slightly. What were those signs of you being neurodivergent as a sign that you picked up on within your childhood, or you didn't recognize it at that time?
I definitely always felt like I couldn't quite fit in. Do you know what I mean? I always felt on the periphery, and I remember, I do remember even in reception, kind of at preschool, play school as it was called back then. I do remember struggling to kind of fit in, and one example of where that I always remember, I must have been about 7 or 8, right? And I was over at my friend's house, and his older brother asked me where I live, and I gave him my full address, including my postcode. And that's something I still reflect on, because I don't think a neurotypical child would have given that kind of full that full detail. And I think there's other bits where I reflect on. I like detail. I have an eye for detail. I think that's a real strength of being autistic, is that eye for detail. But kind of neurotypical people, it's the time is 11:10, right? If we were to have a break, then I would say we come back at 11:20, and it would be exactly 11:20. And I think it's stuff like that. I've always hate being late for things. Was always on time for school. Again, I don't think typical people do that. I always struggled kind of socially, but at the same time was never that bothered about having lots of friends, and I still don't. I find it fascinating that there's almost this social currency around how many friends you have, whereas I've always been very lucky. I've had a small group of very close friends, and I've always kind of felt like that. So there's lots of different signs. I'm also doing that autistic thing of rambling, Juliana, so you'll need to get me back on track, right? And that's cool, because I know I ramble a lot and my brain goes off in a different direction.
You're doing brilliantly. I think sharing those experiences in terms of, actually, it wasn't a challenge for you. It was something that sort of you were able to adapt to it and finding your group of friends. There might not be a larger network, but it's something that actually worked for you. I think that's the key. I think there's always that need to want to have a larger group. But is it always needed?
Yeah, I don't know. It amazes me when people have like large groups of friends. I don't know how they physically have the time to do it. I mean, even within my small group of friends, I struggle to see them, and kind of find that quite exhausting. That but when people have large groups of friends, like, wow, how do you manage that? That's incredible to me, that you might even be able to kind of maintain that contact. As I say, if after a social interaction, I'm absolutely drained by it. So then the thought of having to do that and do that and do that again would just be like, whoa, I just couldn't cope with that.
Yeah, that's an experience I can completely relate with. Okay, in terms of, you've built such an amazing and incredible career, and you have such a great journey, starting as a learning disability nurse and then later qualifying as a social worker. What drew you to working with neurodivergent individuals?
You know what? It's really interesting, because I've just always had an affinity with neurodivergent individuals, and now I realise it's because I myself am neurodivergent. But I had a really I fell into nursing. At 18, I went and I did voluntary work. I lived with a learning disabled and autistic chap as a living carer. That was my journey into nursing, and I just thoroughly enjoyed it. I thoroughly enjoyed that experience of living with this individual. And I grew up in a very nice village in Essex, very very quintessential British, very nice kind of part of Essex. And then I ended up in Newport living with this guy in a really completely different to what I'd grown up in. And I saw his struggles firsthand, but I also saw his resilience firsthand, and I that kind of stayed with me. I think I've always had that. I've always rooted for the underdog, and personally, if you tell me I can't do something, then that's like, I will do it. I will absolutely do it. And throughout my career, I've seen that with neurodivergent people. I think we are a very resilient people, and if you tell us we can't do something, then we will, and we will prove to you that we can do it, and we might zigzag there, and we might not take the most direct route, but we will do it. And I think that's why I've always kind of enjoyed that work. And and for me, I've reflected on this more in the last last year or so, really. But prior to that, I could easily have ended up going down that route. There was a real sliding doors moment in my own life where I could have ended up going to a special school. That was a real possibility for me, and that didn't happen. And I'm very lucky. I've been very fortunate throughout my life, but it could easily have gone it could have easily gone differently. And I think I've always had that as well. When I've worked with people, I've always had that at the back of my mind or the front of my mind. The roles could easily have been reversed. You know what I mean? And I think that's important. And I think that's something that I've reflected on, and I say the way disabled people generally, the way society kind of views vulnerability is not something I'm very comfortable with. I think we need to challenge it, and it doesn't matter whether it's what it is, and that's something that's always driven me, and that's what got me into nursing. That's what got me into social work, and 25 years. I started my first job. I did that voluntary work in 2000, and I still, 25 years, I still have that same drive. I still have that same passion. I kind of hope that if I could meet the 18-year-old me, I would still be able to look him in the eye and say, actually, the reasons why you wanted to do this are still there, and I think that's important. And if I ever lose that, then it's time for me to pack up and do something completely different. But actually, the fire that was within me at 18 is still there at 43, and so I hope, and that's kind of that's within me. Do you know what I mean? I hope that's there.
No, absolutely. And sort of that just moves us quite nicely to the next question in terms of that progression. You've been so passionate, and you've now progressed into your leadership role, and including becoming the head of service in a local authority. How did you approach leadership, especially as someone who was navigating this world as a neurodivergent individual?
I mean, I've always asked why, and again, it's if you speak to neurodivergent people, and there's a danger of having a stereotype and generalization, but a lot of neurodivergent people I speak to and talk to, we ask the why questions. And when I was a social worker, I would always ask why, and I was always interested in systems, and it was that systemic leadership. And what drew me to leadership was when I had a caseload as a social worker, I'd be like, right, I can have a direct impact on my caseload, and that's great, but actually I want a broader impact. I want a team impact. And and then I became a team manager, and I was like, this is awesome. I love being a team manager, but I want the service kind of impact, and so on and so forth. So I've always had that interest. And in my current role, I'm very lucky. I am able to have a systemic impact and a service-wide impact, and that's really cool for me, and that's what I enjoy about being leadership. And going back to the whole 18-year-old self, that's what I hope that where I work and where I have worked, I make that systemic impact. I think the challenges of management as an autistic person is the unwritten rules. I really struggle with that, and it amazes me that neurotypical people seem to understand these unwritten rules almost intuitively, whereas for me as an autistic person, and maybe it's a similar experience for other neurodivergent people, it doesn't run through. And now I'm desperately trying to think of an unwritten rule as an example and struggling, but it'll come back to me in about 2 hours time probably. But do you know what, I think there are a lot of kind of stereotypes around neurodivergent people, around autistic people, particularly with empathy. And as I'm sure you're aware, Juliana, there's a lot around emotional intelligence and being an emotional intelligent leader, right? And that's cool. We should treat people and respect people and kind of understand kind of where they're coming from. But as an autistic person, I do struggle with that. I do struggle to understand that. But what I desperately try and do is learn around that and reflect on that. So when I'm working with people and when I'm leading people, when I'm in teams, I will own, I have said, if you're upset, I will not necessarily understand. I won't even realise you're upset, right? And that can be a challenge, but I've always said, but it doesn't mean I don't care. I do care. But I think for a lot of people, maybe the majority of society, if somebody is upset, they recognise that and their brain goes, oh, this person's upset, I need to comfort them. I would need you to tell me you're upset. And that I think is the challenge. Now, once I know you're upset, then we can work through it, and I hope that I do that emotional stuff reasonably well. But it's that, like, body language. I don't really pick up on body language. You could be incredibly happy or incredibly sad and I wouldn't recognise it. And again, that can be a challenge in a team. But how I address that, and I've been doing this for years, this hasn't just been since diagnosis, it's been pre-diagnosis, it's being honest with people around that and kind of having that discussion and that understanding and that trusting relationship. Do you know what I mean? So I think, but definitely that body language is a real challenge that I've personally kind of personally faced. The hierarchy thing, which again is a bit of a stereotype of neurodivergent people, but something I certainly reflect on. I will speak to everybody the same, and I think that's a good thing. And when we're kids, we're told that, aren't we? Treat everyone the same and treat everyone respectfully. But there is an expectation that you might moderate your behaviour from, if you're speaking to a chief executive, to, I don't know, somebody else. Do you know what I mean? Somebody who has less responsibility. And I've kind of always struggled with that. I remember when I did a nurse placement and I referred to somebody as a mate. You're right, mate. And I thought I was being friendly, and I got absolutely I was not. My tutor was like, you can't call people mate there. And I didn't understand why. So again, reflecting on that, were there signs about autism? Yes, there were lots, and that maybe is another example.
Absolutely. You have spent a period advocating for others. But have there been moments when you've had to advocate for yourself within the professional setting?
Yeah, consistently. Yeah, continually. I it's interesting, isn't it? Because I like to think that I have developed a really kind of good mask over the last 40 years, and actually, and I kind of, and think that I have done a good job of kind of presenting myself in the neurotypical way. But actually I haven't. I clearly haven't, and that in itself has created, it kind of created challenges. So it's kind of reflecting on that, around realizing that I'm not always clear and concise. I do, I like things to be black and white, and I like to give clear and concise kind of information, but I've been told that I use words that other people don't generally use. Apparently I use I have a different vocabulary to other people, and that's because the English language is wonderful, and I think, at times we don't make full use of the wonderful colour we have within it, right? So so I think that's where I've had to kind of advocate and moderate, because there have been other times when I don't understand. Sensory processing is a real challenge, and that that can be difficult. You know, if I'm in a room and there's lots of information being thrown, verbal, written, other bits, I will really struggle with that. And at times I've had to say, can you resend this for me? But the challenge is, there's almost a perception that managers are meant to be almost like perfect. Do you know what I mean? Does that make any sense to you? And I think when I got my first team management role, I was managing a drug and alcohol service, and I thought I needed to be perfect, and I struggled with that because no one's perfect. I mean, some of us might like to think we are, but we're not, right? Actually, humans are not by definition perfect. But I think as I've gone through my career, I'm far more confident now to say I don't know, or I don't understand, or can something be repeated, than, you know, my first management job would have been 2012, 13 years ago. But my very first leadership role, I qualified as a nurse in 2004 and was pretty much managing shifts straight away. So, you know, using leadership in its broadest sense, I've had 21 years of leadership experience, and I think that's where I've got better. I'm far more confident now to say I don't understand, or can you repeat it, than I would have done 10, 15, definitely 20 years ago.
It's great to hear how your confidence has increased as your career has progressed. And when we think of barriers to career progression, what are some of the key challenges you believe that organizations need to make to create a genuinely inclusive environment?
Oh, you know what? There's still a lot of negative stereotypes and myths around there, and that's across the board, right? But I think probably looking through it through a neurodivergent lens, I've touched on one of them. Autistic people lack empathy. No, we don't. In fact, there's lots of evidence, or lots might be exaggerating, but there's recent evidence that shows actually that autistic people have hyper empathy, and when we can feel things kind of greater than the neurotypical people. So I think it's a lot around that mythology. Another one, you know, challenging stereotypes, around kind of, you must be systems focused, and I have a systems brain. But I'll tell you, when I was at school, it was like, oh, you should go into computers, Dan. You should go into computers, Dan. Do you know what I mean? And I know how to use a computer. And to be honest with you, I find them quite easy to navigate around because they're quite logical. But I had no desire to spend my life on computers, you know, and that's another thing, you know. Social work, social work is a people profession. And I've, had feedback, oh, it's strange for an autistic person to want to work with people. Well, why is that? You know, social work is about social justice, which again is really strong. And if you look at neurodivergent literature and speak to neurodivergent people, that's a really common thread. We have a real strong desire for social justice. I feel like, neurodivergent people and disabled people in generally, and maybe you could say all marginalised groups, is we struggle to have our voices heard. We struggle to kind of be recognised within society. So that if you've got that experience, it makes you a wonderful person to be a social worker or a nurse or work with people in other areas. That's an absolutely brilliant kind of thing. So I think a lot of it is around that. I think there's a real misconception, organisations hear reasonable adjustments and they see pounds, pennies. It doesn't. I have fidgets. I'm using one now, trying to put it down. This is my own masking. I've just completely blamed my mask by going, look at my fidget. But anyway, this literally cost my organisation nothing. Having that flexibility to work from home. Now, my profession, I'm very lucky I get it. If you're working on a construction site, there's no way you can work from home when you're building something, right? But there must be other reasonable adjustments. So I think it's around that. It's recognising the strengths of neurodivergent people. And again, there's lots of studies, and you'll know this better than I do, Juliana. Actually, the most kind of productive organisations are the ones that are diverse. And that's what, that's what we kind of need to look at as well. It's, it will strengthen organisations to have diversity within it. And making people feel safe as well. You need to have that that safety for people. People need to trust their managers, but they need to trust their peers. They need to trust the organisation. And again, I'm very lucky where I work. I have a very good supportive manager. And the organisation is very supportive around kind of neurodiversity and changing that. But I know that there are other sectors and other industries and other countries where that's not the same.
So Dan, I wanted to ask, there are many neurodivergent individuals who may be navigating career challenges or struggling with self-acceptance. What advice would you offer based on your own journey?
The self-acceptance is a really good question, because often kind of there's a lot of talk around ableism, and ableism is a real factor. That kind of expectation that neurodivergent people and disabled people kind of adhere to neurotypical expectations. So you see that a lot. But I think my own reflection is like my internalized ableism gets in the way of, and going back to the earlier question, what was it like to be diagnosed at 42? One of the things I've really struggled to get my head around, and still do, is that I have a medically defined and diagnosed disability, and I struggle with that still. I really do. And I still, and I think that, and I kind of recognize in myself that I have a lot of internalized ableism. Why can't I do things? I'm doing a master's at the moment, and as part of the master's, I had to do a presentation in January. And for the first time in my life, this is the third time I've gone to uni now, and it's the first time I've ever asked for reasonable adjustments. Right, I asked for the questions for the presentation to be sent in advance, and I asked for an extra 5 minutes, and I felt it was really difficult for me to ask that because of this internalized ableism, and I was like, well, you've gone through uni twice without it. And actually this course, I'm writing my final year now, I finish in a couple of months, so it's almost like I've done 2.5 years of this course without asking for reasonable adjustments. Why do you need them now? But actually I do need them now, and the reasonable adjustments made a big difference. And I think so for me, like going back to your question, what would my advice be to someone else in a similar position, is kind of recognizing that internalized ableism and actually working with it, because I think that's that's important. I think that we're socialized so you don't ask for help and you just get on with it, and I think that is part of that. So my first bit would be recognize your internalized ableism and do that reflection within, and then it's almost like the challenging as well. Challenge the externalized ableisms. Now that's easier said than done, I get that, but it is it is important. Advocate for yourself. I'm much better at advocating for myself. So I take fidgets into work. I will wear the loops. I find them amazing. So if I'm going into a meeting room, and I will try and sit at a seat at the far end of the table to reduce the sensory impact of that, and I'm quite open and honest about that, and I've told colleagues about that. No, nothing. So one of the things I've been fortunate enough to do where I work is set up a group for neurodivergent staff. Went live. We had our first meeting in December, and it's been really good. And there was a meeting this week, and one of the discussions we had was around apologizing, and how we often neurodivergent people end up apologizing for doing things that we do. And it's like, well, why do we do that? We should stop apologizing for just being ourselves, because neurotypical people don't apologize for being themselves. Do you know what I mean? It was a really interesting discussion. The other bit as well, though, is that I really like the concept of double empathy, and I think that's really important, because for those people who are watching who don't know what double empathy is, so double empathy is that a neurotypical person trying to understand my experience as an autistic person. So noise is a good one, right? So if I'm meeting with a neurotypical colleague then thinking, I'm not going to meet Dan in a busy office, I'm going to find somewhere that's quiet because I know that he can manage the sensory processing. So that would be an example of that individual. But then for me, recognizing that when I'm meeting with that person in the office, they might find it, they might find that equally as uncomfortable, because we're in a room away from other people. I'm not sure if that's the best example, but that's ultimately what it is. It's effectively understanding each other's perspective, and I think that's really important, because sometimes the narrative is neurotypical people need to understand the experience of neurodivergent people, and I get that, but we also need to understand the experience of neurotypical people as well, because it's that shared understanding, isn't it? That's that shared knowledge. That's what we need to do. The other thing as well, though, and I've kind of in danger of going back on a bit of a loop here, but like reasonable adjustments that can make an impact in the office would make an impact for everybody. I can't imagine anybody enjoys working in a really busy, noisy office. Maybe they do, but I can't imagine they do. So if we can do things that can reduce the noise for neurodivergent individuals, then that's going to have a benefit for everybody, I would argue. And again, I think it's sometimes there's almost a them and us narrative. It almost seems a bit binary. It's not. We have shared space, we share the planet, we have to live together. So let's try and get to understand each other's perspectives. I think the other thing as well is that, one of the questions I had was, why did you get diagnosed in your 40s? And I think I got that quite a lot, but for me, that's really, I'm pleased I have. I'm really pleased I got that diagnosis. It's helped beyond, it's immeasurable. It's helped so much. And yes, there's been ups and downs, and there will be ups and downs, but life is up and down, isn't it? That's what it is. But I think for me, it's the diagnosis has kind of explained things. It kind of, and given me a different sense. I genuinely thought that everybody before meeting somebody would rehearse a script in their mind 100 times. Apparently neurotypical people don't do that. Apparently neurotypical people can spontaneously converse with people. It's amazing to me. I wasn't really aware that it was an autistic and a neurodivergent first thing to script. The other thing is, it's I struggle with facial recognition. If I go into a room full of people, I'm just seeing blank faces. And I go in, I thought that was fairly common. Apparently not. So, I think there are real benefits to late diagnosis. And then, what I sort of other advice would be just be confident in advocating for yourself, and look at the changes that can be done.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Dan. I guess looking ahead, what is your vision for the future of neurodiversity in leadership and professional spaces?
I really want there to be more visible neurodivergent leaders. There are, I think there are not many really people talking about kind of neurodivergent leaderships. And there is lots of training now. There's kind of an increase in training and awareness for neurotypical people around neurodivergence, which is great. That's a really valid. But what I'd like to see is that more neurodivergent leaders, we are doing that training. We are educating. We are promoting. We are doing that challenge. One of the reasons why I'm doing this, one of the reasons why I've done other bits in work where I've done the podcast and stuff like that, is because I'd hate for any individual, a neurodivergent individual, to think that leadership is beyond them because of them being neurodivergent. And no, I've been very lucky in my career. I've been fairly, fortunate. I've got to a fairly, high level. If you look at hierarchy in my career, I've had, I want people to feel that it shouldn't stop us. So that's what I want to see. I want challenge the a lot of the approaches, a lot of the kind of applied behavior analysis approaches in terms of stopping people to kind of, when I trained as a nurse, it was a lot of applied behavior analysis. So if somebody or had a stimming behaviour, then we would try to stop them doing that stimming behaviour, which is actually really dangerous for people. So I think I'd like a bit more of a narrative around that. I think it's about being truly inclusive and kind of really, leading by example, because anybody can say I want to be inclusive and any organisation can say, but like I was always taught, kind of actions are louder than words, and that's what I'd like to see. I think there needs to be an honest discussion as well, because there's a danger that we look at creating a perfect world for neurodivergent people, and that's not going to happen because it's not a perfect world. But so I think we need to be honest around that, and I just think it's around, just being visible. There are like, there should be. Well, we know that people, there's an underdiagnosis. Despite a lot of the media, there is still an underdiagnosis of kind of neurodivergent people. So I'd like to see kind of more neurodivergent leaders coming forward and sharing their diagnosis with people, because I think that's important as well, so that we that visibility.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I think it's really important to be able to see those role models, because sometimes you feel quite isolated in terms of how far you can progress. But when you're able to see those individuals who are role modeling similar characteristics that you may have, it definitely inspires you to sort of want to go into leadership, etc. Okay. If there is one narrative about neurodivergence that you hope this podcast will help change, what would that be?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think it reflected on my own experience. I think like be open to learning about yourself. I think that's really important. I think to have that, to kind of to be open to learning about yourself, open to learn about others. And what I really kind of enjoy is I am obviously autistic, as I've probably mentioned 100 times throughout this podcast, right? But I'm really interested in the whole neurodivergence umbrella, and that's fascinating to me. I also reflect that since in the 25 years I've been working with neurodivergent people, our knowledge, our understanding, our language has changed significantly. And that's really cool, and I'm really excited about the changes over the next 25 years. So if I was to sum it up, it would be, be open to learning about yourselves, be open to learning about others. And if we do that, then actually we will, things will always go from strength to strength, would be my way of summing it up, Juliana.
Dan, thank you so much for sharing your story and insight with us today. Your journey is a powerful testament of self-discovery and advocating for lasting change. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in. If you have been inspired by Dan's story, don't forget to subscribe and share our episodes as well. Thank you.
Thank you.